You know what's strange? We talk endlessly about boomers. We analyze millennials like a case study. We dissect Gen Z as if they're a brand new species. But there's an entire generation that just exists in the middle, rarely mentioned, barely noticed. Generation X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980. They're your older coworkers who never complain. Your parents who seem oddly detached sometimes. The people who helped build the internet, but don't feel the need to post about their breakfast. And here's what nobody really talks about. Their psychology might be the most misunderstood of any living generation. Gen X was the first generation of latchkey kids on a massive scale. Picture this. It's 1978. You're 8 years old. You come home to an empty house. No smartphone, no security cameras. No way for anyone to check if you made it home safely. You let yourself in. You make a snack, you do your homework alone, and you wait. By the early 1980s, studies showed that millions of children between the ages of 5 and 13 were regularly unsupervised after school. That's not just a statistic. That's an entire generation learning something early. You can't always count on someone being there. That empty house did more than teach independence, it taught consequences. If you messed up, there was no buffer, no negotiation, no emotional processing session. When your parents came home, you knew exactly where you stood. Rules were clear. Punishments were immediate. Nobody asked how you felt about it. Psychologically, this created what researchers call a high-contingency environment. Actions and outcomes were directly linked. No delay, no safety net. Your brain learned to predict consequences in real time. That's why Gen X tends to think several steps ahead. Why they anticipate problems before they happen. Why they often seem calm in chaos. But that wasn't the only contradiction they grew up with. They watched their parents preach stability. And then divorce and record numbers. They watched people give their lives to companies, only to be laid off without warning. They were told, work hard, follow the rules. It'll all work out. And then they watched the rules change in real time. So yes, psychologists might call it defensive pessimism. Gen X just calls it realism. They're not exactly cynical. They're armored. They hope for good outcomes. But deep down, they expect the rug to be pulled out. Because it usually was. And that mindset shaped everything that came after. Their relationship with work, with authority, with privacy. And especially with visibility. Because growing up being invisible wasn't a flaw. It was protection. And that's where their psychology really begins to make sense. Gen X grew up in a world where privacy was normal. When you messed up as a kid, maybe a handful of people knew. And then it was over. No phones, no recordings. No viral moments following you for the rest of your life. Mistakes were temporary, embarrassment faded, life moved on. So when social media arrived and asked everyone to broadcast their inner world, Gen X didn't see opportunity. They saw risk. It's not that they don't understand technology. They helped build it. It's that they learned early on a simple rule. The less people know about you, the safer you are. This is why Gen X is often invisible online. They observe. They scroll. They rarely post, not because they have nothing to say, but because they don't feel the need to say it publicly. And this instinct for distance shaped another defining trait: irony. Gen X didn't grow up with optimism as a default setting. They grew up during the Cold War. Duck and cover drills, nuclear anxiety treated like weather. Adults told them everything might end tomorrow, and then insisted they shouldn't worry about it. So they learned to hold two opposing truths at once. Things are serious, but don't take them too seriously. Irony became a shield, a way to stay emotionally mobile. Close enough to care, far enough not to be crushed. Crack a joke. Shrug it off, laugh before it hurts. That emotional distance isn't apathy, it's adaptation. Because when authority figures constantly contradict themselves, you learn not to fully invest. And Gen X had plenty of reasons not to. They watched political scandals unfold in real time. Watergate, Iran-Contra, public trust collapsing on television. They learned early that titles don't guarantee competence. And promises don't guarantee outcomes. So they became skeptical of authority, but not rebellious. They respect skill. They respect results. If you know what you're doing, they'll follow you anywhere. If you don't, they have no patience. And this filtered into how they work. Gen X doesn't advertise effort. They don't romanticize hustle, they just do the job. That work ethic was forged early through jobs that sound almost unreal today. Paper routes at dawn, bagging groceries after school, Fast food registers where you had to calculate change in your head when the machine broke. These weren't resume builders. They were survival training. They taught responsibility without applause. And Gen X internalized a powerful lesson. You don't control the system, but you can control your competence. They watched their parents' loyalty to companies end in layoffs, so they never believed in company loyalty. They believed in being useful, in being hard to replace. And that belief shaped how they approach everything. But here's the paradox. For a generation that learned to stand alone so early, Gen X is quietly collaborative in ways people rarely notice. And that's where things get even more interesting. Here's the paradox at the core of Generation X. They are one of the most independent generations in history, and also one of the most quietly collaborative. Gen X learned early how to be alone, not as a philosophy, as a necessity. When you grow up letting yourself into an empty house at 8 years old, you don't wait for help, you figure it out. And that mindset never really leaves. Gen X doesn't ask for assistance easily. They troubleshoot first, then try again, then try something else. Asking for help feels like a last resort, not because they're proud, but because dependence was never an option. Researchers have noticed this pattern clearly. Studies in adult development show that Gen X reports lower levels of seeking social support during stressful periods. Not because they lack people, but because asking feels like failure, so they become exceptionally good in crisis. When things go wrong, Gen X doesn't panic. They get practical. Fix the problem, handle the mess, move on. But that competence often comes with a cost. Self-reliance can quietly turn into anxiety. Because if you're the one who always handles things, you never fully relax. And yet, despite this fierce independence, Gen X shows up for others in a way that's almost invisible. They won't announce it. They won't post about it. They won't brand it as kindness. They just do it. If you need help moving, they're there. If something breaks, they fix it. If you're overwhelmed, they sit next to you and help you think. No speeches. No emotional performance. This comes from the way Gen X formed relationships. When parents were absent, friendships mattered. They became chosen families. Loyalty wasn't loud, it was practical. And this same logic shaped how Gen X relates to authority. They don't respect titles. They respect competence. If you know what you're doing, they'll work with you, back you, support you fully. If you don't, no amount of hierarchy will save you. Gen X questions authority not because they're rebellious, but because they watched incompetent authority make disastrous decisions throughout their childhood. Political scandals, economic mismanagement, public institutions failing in real time. So they learned to evaluate leaders by outcomes, not words. And this mindset followed them into adulthood at the worst possible moments. The oldest Gen Xers were finding their footing when economic instability hit. The youngest graduated straight into the dot-com crash. Just as they recovered, the 2008 financial crisis arrived. Repeated economic shocks taught them a brutal lesson. Nothing lasts. Which is why Gen X is more likely to diversify income. Not out of ambition, out of survival. Multiple skills. Multiple options. Multiple backups. They don't assume stability. They plan for disruption. And this constant readiness shaped how they think, learn, and adapt. But to understand Gen X fully, you have to look at how they processed information itself. Because before Google, knowledge carried weight. And that changed everything. Before the internet, information had weight. If you wanted an answer, you didn't type it. You went looking for it, libraries, card catalogs. Hours spent searching for a single book that might hold what you needed. Knowledge wasn't instant. It required effort. And because of that effort, it stayed. Cognitive psychologists describe this as deeper encoding. Information that costs time and energy becomes more deeply embedded in memory. Gen X learned this early. They learned how to fix things because that's what you did. When your bike chain slipped, you didn't call someone. You flipped it upside down, got grease on your hands, and figured it out. When the TV flickered, you didn't replace it. You adjusted it, tapped it, tried again. This built something modern culture rarely teaches, a belief that the world is understandable. That with patience and persistence you can master it. And now Gen X is watching their children grow up in a completely different environment. One of constant supervision, constant connection, constant visibility. They gave their kids what they never had: attention, protection, presence. But quietly, they worry. Not because the world is worse, but because visibility feels dangerous to them. In the Gen X worldview, being visible means being vulnerable. They remember what it was like to be alone with boredom, with uncertainty, with your own thoughts. They understand the value of silence because they lived in it. And this is why Generation X is often misunderstood. They're not disengaged, they're not indifferent. They're not apathetic, they're the bridge generation. They grew up at the end of the old world and adapted to the beginning of the new one. They understand life before the internet and life after it. They hold analog patience and digital competence at the same time. And bridges don't get much attention. No one stops to admire them. They're just there, holding weight, connecting sides, keeping things moving. Generation X doesn't ask to be noticed. They don't perform resilience, they don't demand recognition. They just show up, do the work, and expect very little in return. And maybe that's the most Gen 10 trait of all. Not caring if anyone notices. If this resonated, it's because people shaped by that era tend to share a deeper psychology, a comfort with solitude, a skepticism of noise, a preference for competence over performance. In the next video, we're going to explore another pattern that connects generations in unexpected ways. One that explains why some people value privacy more than connection, and why being unseen sometimes feels safer than being understood. If this felt familiar, the next one will feel even closer.